Hi, I'm Emily. Before I dive into what went down, please make sure to like and subscribe for more of the real-life drama that you just can't make up. Now, let me tell you about the day when everything hit the fan with my mother-in-law, Mrs. Wallace. It was a typical sunny afternoon in our cozy suburban home. Mark and I were in the kitchen, laughing over a batch of burnt cookies, when his phone buzzed. The smile faded from his face as soon as he saw the caller ID. It was his mom, Mrs. Wallace, and we both knew it wouldn't be a happy family chat. "Hey Mom, what's up?" Mark tried to keep his tone light, but his stiff posture told me he was bracing for impact. "You tell me, Mark. I just found out your father was at your house last week, and you didn't think to invite me? What are you hiding from me?" Her voice was sharp, each word dipped in suspicion and anger. "Mom, Dad just dropped by on his way back from a conference. It was last minute. Nothing planned," Mark explained, his voice calm but firm. "And you didn't think I'd want to see him too? What are you, his favorite now? Is that it?" There was a rustling sound, like she was pacing around, her heels clicking ominously over the phone. I could see Mark was struggling to maintain his composure. "It's not like that, Mom. It was just a quick visit. Nothing important." "Everything your father does is important to me. You should know that by now, Mark. But clearly Emily is turning you against me, keeping family away. I won't stand for it." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own frustration in check. This wasn't the first time Mrs. Wallace had thrown accusations my way. Ever since Mark and I got married, it felt like she was on a mission to paint me as the villain in her perfect family drama. Mark ended the call shortly after, assuring his mother there was no conspiracy to keep her out of the loop. He apologized to me, running his hands through his hair. "I'm so sorry, Em. I know how hard you try with her." "It's not your fault," I said, though the whole situation was draining. "But I'm getting really tired of being the bad guy, Mark. Your mom has something against me and it's getting worse." We spent the rest of the evening going over past incidents, trying to figure out a way to deal with Mrs. Wallace's increasingly toxic behavior. She'd had a history of subtle digs and outright commands, trying to dictate not just Mark's life, but mine as well. "Remember last Christmas?" I said, pouring us both a drink. She told me how to decorate our house, and when I didn't follow her advice, she sulked the entire evening and made everyone uncomfortable. "Yeah, and there was the time she tried to convince me to apply for a job I didn't want, just because she liked the idea of bragging about it to her friends," Mark added, frustration clear in his tone. As we talked, it became clear that we needed a plan. Mrs. Wallace wasn't just overbearing. She was manipulative and controlling, and it was affecting our marriage. We needed to set some boundaries, firmly and soon. "So, what do we do?" Mark asked, looking as lost as I felt. "We need to stand up to her together. She has to understand she can't control our lives. Next time she pulls a stunt, we record it. We gather evidence of her behavior," I proposed, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. Mark nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do that. It's going to be tough, but I'm with you. We can't go on like this." We didn't know it then, but that conversation was just the beginning. We were about to enter a battle we never wanted, but knew we had to fight. Not just for our peace, but for our future together. Thanks for listening, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe for what's coming next because, trust me, it's going to be a wild ride. It was another peaceful evening, or so it seemed, until Mrs. Wallace's voice shattered the calm. I wasn't meant to overhear it, but there I was, frozen next to the slightly ajar door of Mark's home office. The conversation on speakerphone pierced through the silence like a siren. "You need to think about your future, Mark. That woman is tearing our family apart. She doesn't respect where you come from or what this family stands for. You have to end it for your own good." My heart raced, blood pounding in my ears. The raw venom in Mrs. Wallace's voice was unmistakable. Divorce? She wanted Mark to leave me because she thought I was dividing their family? I pressed my back against the wall, feeling the weight of her words squeezing the air from the room. I waited until Mark replied, his voice a mix of confusion and frustration. "Mom, that's insane. Emily is my wife. She's part of this family now." "But she's changing you, Mark, can't you see? You used to be so devoted to us, and now? It's always what Emily wants, what Emily thinks." The conversation went on, with Mrs. Wallace listing every perceived slight and disagreement, painting me as the villain in their family saga. I slipped away quietly, my mind racing. By the time Mark found me in the living room, I was pacing, each step fueled by anger and hurt. Emily, did you know she'd say something like that? That she wants us to get a divorce? My voice was sharp, the hurt evident. Mark sighed, running his hands through his hair, a sign of his stress. No, I swear I didn't know she'd go that far. But she's my mom. She's always been intense. Intense? That was one way to put it. I thought about all the times Mrs. Wallace had imposed her will, not just on Mark, but on everyone around her. Mark grew up under her oppressive love, which left little room for his own desires. She had shaped his world, deciding his hobbies, his career path, even his friends. Mark, I get that she's your mom, and I've really tried to understand that. But wanting us to split up? That's not just being intense. That's toxic. We can't just ignore this. Mark looked torn, a son caught between his wife and the overbearing mother whose approval he had always sought. I know. It's just, she's always been like this. It's hard to confront her. And what about us? What about what we need? I challenged, unwilling to let the moment pass. We can't live our lives always trying to please her. We need boundaries, Mark. Real ones. And we need them now. Mark nodded, the resolve slowly building in his eyes. You're right. Let's do something about it. Let's show her she can't control us. Not like this. The decision was made. Together, we would stand up to Mrs. Wallace. We would record her outbursts, document her attempts to manipulate, and build a case if needed. It was a plan born of desperation, a strategy to reclaim our lives from the shadow of a controlling matriarch. The task ahead was daunting, and neither of us knew quite how to begin, but we were determined. For our marriage, for our future, we would face the storm that was Mrs. Wallace. Together. With a plan forming, the next step was getting the right allies on board. I called Sarah, my best friend since college, and Annie, Mark's younger sister, who'd also felt the sting of Mrs. Wallace's sharp tongue more than once. Both were more than willing to help. They'd seen enough of Mrs. Wallace's drama to last a lifetime. Emily, we've got to catch her in the act, Sarah insisted over the phone. It's the only way Mark and the rest of the family will really see what she's like. Annie chimed in during our three-way call, her voice a mix of determination and nervous energy. I'm in. She's been pulling this stuff for years. It's time someone stood up to her. The plan was simple, yet risky. We would invite Mrs. Wallace over under the pretense of a family dinner. Something innocuous, something she wouldn't suspect. Mark would bring up a topic we knew would set her off, and we would be ready to capture every word, every manipulative tactic on camera. The day before the dinner, Sarah, Annie, and I met at my house to finalize everything. Sarah brought over some hidden cameras and microphones, which we strategically placed around the living room and dining area. We need to make sure we get everything on tape, clear audio and video. We can't let her wriggle her way out of this one by claiming she was misquoted or taken out of context, Sarah explained, testing the angles. Annie nodded, reviewing the placement of the cameras on her tablet. These should cover the whole room, and I've got backups recording just in case. As we set up, I briefed them on how the evening would go. Once dinner's winding down, Mark will bring up his dad's recent visits to us. How much he enjoys them, how good they are for his stress levels. That'll get her going. Are you sure you want to do this, Emily? Annie asked, a hint of concern in her voice. She's going to be furious. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. It has to be done, for all of us. Mark needs to see her true colors in full display. It's the only way he'll ever break free from her control. The day of the dinner arrived, and the tension was palpable. Mark knew his role, though I could tell he was anxious. The guests arrived, Mrs. Wallace sweeping into our home with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The dinner passed with superficial chatter, everyone playing their part in the calm before the storm. As the dessert was served, Mark took a deep breath and started the conversation we had rehearsed. Mom, Dad's been coming by a lot lately. It's really been great seeing him more. He seems a lot happier, too, getting away from the city. I watched Mrs. Wallace's face change, her smile tightening. Oh, really? More visits? And here I thought he was just busy with work. Seems odd he has all this time to visit but can't take his own wife along. Mark pressed on, feigning ignorance. He just needs some space, I guess. It's good for him. Space? From me? Mrs. Wallace's voice rose, her veneer cracking. What exactly are you implying, Mark? That I'm smothering him? Is that what Emily is telling you? There it was, the opening salvo of what was sure to be a revealing battle. The cameras rolled, capturing every word, every accusation. This was the moment of truth, and there was no turning back. The family dinner had reached a critical juncture. As Mrs. Wallace's face reddened with anger, everyone at the table stiffened, sensing the storm about to break. "Why are you doing this, Mark? Are you really that blind? Or is Emily feeding you lies about me, trying to turn you against me?" Mrs. Wallace's voice climbed with each word, her facade of polite concern crumbling away. "Mom, that's not fair. No one is turning me against anyone. I'm just saying Dad seems happier. Why is that wrong?" Mark's voice was steady, but I could see him shaking slightly, the strain of confronting his mother evident. "Because you're implying I make him unhappy, that I'm some kind of tyrant." Mrs. Wallace shot back, slamming her hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "And you, Emily, always playing the innocent. You think I don't see how you manipulate my son? You've wanted him away from his family since day one." I kept my voice calm, pushing forward with the plan. "I think you're reading too much into things, Mrs. Wallace. No one here thinks you're a tyrant. We're just concerned about Dad's well-being, that's all." "That's all? Really, Emily? Or is this another one of your games? You enjoy seeing me upset, don't you?" Her eyes were wild, her accusations more frantic and baseless by the second. The rest of the family watched, wide-eyed, as Mrs. Wallace's usual poised demeanor unraveled. Annie and Sarah exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of shock and pity. They had known Mrs. Wallace was controlling, but the raw display of anger and paranoia was more intense than they had anticipated. I watched Mrs. Wallace's face change, her smile tightening. "Oh, really? More visits? And here I thought he was just busy with work. Seems odd he has all this time to visit but can't take his own wife along." Mark pressed on, feigning ignorance. "He just needs some space, I guess. It's good for him." "Space? For me?" Mrs. Wallace's voice rose, her veneer cracking. "What exactly are you implying, Mark? That I'm smothering him? Is that what Emily is telling you?" There it was, the opening salvo of what was sure to be a revealing battle. The cameras rolled, capturing every word, every accusation. This was the moment of truth, and there was no turning back. The family dinner had reached a critical juncture. As Mrs. Wallace's face reddened with anger, everyone at the table stiffened, sensing the storm about to break. "Why are you doing this, Mark? Are you really that blind? Or is Emily feeding you lies about me, trying to turn you against me?" Mrs. Wallace's voice climbed with each word, her facade of polite concern crumbling away. "Mom, that's not fair. No one is turning me against anyone. I'm just saying Dad seems happier. Why is that wrong?" Mark's voice was steady, but I could see him shaking slightly, the strain of confronting his mother evident. "Because you're implying I make him unhappy, that I'm some kind of tyrant," Mrs. Wallace shot back, slamming her hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "And you, Emily, always playing the innocent. You think I don't see how you manipulate my son? You've wanted him away from his family since day one." I kept my voice calm, pushing forward with the plan. "I think you're reading too much into things, Mrs. Wallace. No one here thinks you're a tyrant. We're just concerned about Dad's well-being, that's all." "That's all? Really, Emily? Or is this another one of your games? You enjoy seeing me upset, don't you?" Her eyes were wild, her accusations more frantic and baseless by the second. The rest of the family watched, wide-eyed, as Mrs. Wallace's usual poised demeanor unraveled. Annie and Sarah exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of shock and pity. They had known Mrs. Wallace was controlling, but the raw display of anger and paranoia was more intense than they had anticipated. "You want to talk about manipulation? What about all those times you insisted Mark and I do things your way, or the times you've guilted us if we disagreed?" I challenged, needing her to reveal more of her true nature, to validate the struggle Mark and I had been enduring. "You are tearing this family apart, Emily. And you, Mark, if you can't see that, you're a fool." Mrs. Wallace stood up, her chair screeching back against the floor, her voice echoing off the walls. Mark looked around the table, his eyes settling on his sister and then back on his mother. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. "Mom, this isn't right. You can't talk to Emily or any of us like that. We're supposed to be a family." The conversation that followed was tense, with family members slowly beginning to voice their own grievances and experiences with Mrs. Wallace's behavior. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of pent-up frustrations and hurt feelings. As the family aired their concerns, Mark's face showed a dawning realization. He began to see the extent of his mother's manipulative tactics, not just against me, but against others he cared about. The video evidence, combined with the personal testimonies of family members, painted a stark picture that was impossible for him to ignore. The confrontation ended with Mrs. Wallace storming out, unable to face the mirror being held up to her actions. The rest of us sat in a somber silence, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. It was painful and cathartic, but necessary. Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it gently, a silent thank you for standing by him through this ordeal. We had faced the storm, and though the skies were still dark, there was a hint of clearing on the horizon. As the legal process unfolded, Mark and I sat across from our lawyer in his well-appointed office, its walls lined with legal tomes that seemed to absorb the gravity of our situation. The lawyer flipped through the pages of our evidence, his expression serious. "Based on everything you've provided," he began, adjusting his glasses, "we have a strong case for a restraining order. Mrs. Wallace's actions clearly constitute harassment and emotional abuse. This will prevent her from making any contact with you, directly or indirectly." Mark nodded, his jaw set. "Do you think she'll fight it?" "It's possible," the lawyer replied, "but the evidence is very compelling. She would have a hard time disputing the video and the testimonies from the family dinner." Leaving the office, Mark seemed to carry a lighter load. We walked to a nearby cafe, a sort of ritual to decompress after our intense meetings. Over coffee, we discussed how to break the news to the family. Mark took out his phone, dialing Annie. "Hey, Annie, we just got out of the lawyer's office. We're moving forward with the restraining order against Mom." I could hear Annie's relieved sigh through the phone. "Thank God. It's been so tough, Mark. I know it's not easy, but it's the right thing to do." "We know," I chimed in. "And we're going to need your support, Annie. We're all in this together." Annie agreed without hesitation, her voice firm. "Absolutely. Let's plan a family meeting. I think everyone will want to be on the same page." The family meeting was held at our house the following weekend. Sarah, Annie, and a few other close relatives gathered in our living room, the air tinged with a mix of apprehension and resolve. Mark took the lead, explaining the steps we were taking and why. The family's reaction was a mix of shock and support. Uncle Joe, always the peacemaker, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Are we sure we want to completely cut ties? There's no going back from this." "It's not about cutting ties out of spite," Mark responded, his voice steady. "It's about protecting our peace and setting boundaries that should have been there a long time ago." Sarah added, "We've all seen the impact of her actions. It's not just about Mark and Emily. It's about the health of the entire family. We can't keep letting her hurt us." The conversation went deep into the evening. Stories and experiences shared, some that had been buried for years. It was clear that while the decision was painful, it was necessary and ultimately supported by the family. As the weeks passed and the restraining order took effect, the immediate relief was palpable. Mark and I could feel the change in our home's atmosphere. It was as if a constant pressure had been lifted. We spent more time focusing on each other and planning for the future. One evening, sitting on our back porch watching the sunset, Mark squeezed my hand. "I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying. I feel like I can breathe again." "And I'm right here with you," I reassured him. "We're going to get through this together." The legal and emotional resolution marked a new chapter for us. While Mrs. Wallace faced the consequences of her actions, our focus shifted to rebuilding and strengthening our bonds. Our marriage, fortified by trials, became a testament to our commitment to each other and to the healthier, happier family we would continue to nurture. That's a wrap on our story, folks. Now here's a question for you. Should family loyalty ever override personal well-being and safety? Mrs. Wallace's behavior drove Mark and Emily to take legal action for their peace of mind. What would you do in their situation? Would you go as far as obtaining a restraining order against a family member? Or would you try to mend things, regardless of past toxicity? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to you.